Welcome to We Got Goals, a podcast by asweatlife.com on which we talk to high achievers about their goals. Today with me on the podcast, I have Jake Bullock, who is co-founder, I should say, and CEO of Cann, which is a cannabis-infused beverage. We love it over here at A Sweat Life. Jake, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
We at A Sweat Life love Cann. I know that we all have our own favorites for flavors, but which flavor are you loving right now before we jump into what Cann is?
Yeah, I bounce around a lot. It's just starting to get into the fall, and so I tend to like the blood orange cardamom. Something about it's like a little bit spicier, it's juicy. It's nice sort of for those last few weeks of summer and starting to get mentally prepared for the fall.
Yeah. Right now, I am loving the lavender lemonade. That's my favorite. It just feels like a bedtime drink. Still hanging on to summer over here in Chicago. We hang on until the very last second.
Yes.
So Jake, before I ask you all of the questions in the world about you and your goals, can you tell us a bit about Cann?
Yes. So Cann, we have a range of microdose cannabis beverage products. By microdose, I mean really, really low amount of THC. So in our core products, we got 2 milligrams of THC. We also have the high boys, which have 5 milligrams. So it's 2.5 times stronger. But for people that have more of a cannabis tolerance, with both those products, the idea though is you drink a number of them, just like you drink a number of glasses of wine or light beers in one setting. And so because of that, it's more social. It integrates really well with alcohol, but you don't have the hangover the next day. You don't have all the emotional regret. It really is a better for you way to socialize. And we're seeing consumers, in all the markets where we're available, trade some of their alcohol, not all of it. People still drink alcohol, right? But some of their alcohol for Cann and have just as much fun while socializing, but feel so much better the next day.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, Cann also has a little bit of CBD in the beverage as well, right?
It does, yeah, we do. So we like CBD in conjunction with THC. We like to joke that they're buds and they have more fun when they're together. There's something about the interaction of the two that really allows you to get the full benefits of both. So you get the sort of anti-anxiety, anti-inflammatory benefits, the sort of feel physically good effects of CBD. And then you also get this euphoric and uplifting effects of THC without the paranoia and some of the anxiety that the CBD really sort of rounds out the experience. It makes it more mild. And often, folks report that experience allows them to be more themselves, socialize more on their own terms. Whereas, alcohol, it's sort of like, how do I make myself a little bit different in order to socialize, which we really like.
I love that. So I have to tell you my own sort of experience with Cann and just with cannabis in general. Mom, if you're listening, just plug your ears. When I smoked weed for the first time, hello, podcast listeners. I was in high school and I did not know what I was doing. And I got very paranoid. And the only thing I could think of was how I was disappointing my parents. And that was like the tailspin in my head. And I carried that until adulthood. I was like, not for me. I'm just going to tailspin and think about how my mom is disappointed in me.
Right.
So at the age, I'm 35 now. So at the age of, and that's a wild thing to hold on to anyway. We could unpack that later. But at the age of 35, I walked into my first dispensary and bought Cann because the packaging is beautiful. It is consumable in a way that I'm comfortable with, and it had the CBD in it. I didn't spin out, and I have been sleeping wonderfully ever since starting to add Cann into my evening routines. That's my story with your brand.
There you go. That's great to hear. And what's great about Cann is you could actually bring that home to mom and she would probably love it. And we hear this all the time from consumers. Like,
she did.
My parents, were not on board with cannabis. Could never imagine them consuming a cannabis product until I brought them Cann, because it doesn't feel the same. It doesn't sort of live in that old legacy space of that smell of cannabis and the smoking and some of the really bad stereotypes that aren't actually true, right, when we dig into it, but that people hold on to. We're kind of hoping to disrupt that and provide folks with a product that feels mainstream and approachable.
Yeah. And my parents did love it, actually. So thanks for asking.
There you go.
So, okay, before we jump in, I'd love to hear the story of, here you are today, you're co-founder of this incredible company. You're going state by state, license, legal approval by legal approval. But talk me through what led you to say, like, we're going to put cannabis in a can.
And then call it Cann. Right. It's a little bit on the
for the
nose.
listener.
Yeah, it was funny. So I had grown up in Colorado. Obviously, Colorado was the first state to put forward a legal recreational cannabis program. And it was always interesting to me, having grown up there. I followed it as it was happening. The types of products, seemed more suited to an illicit legacy market, right? So you had these like little things that were easy to move around and you could make in your kitchen, like chocolates or gummies. And often, the cannabis was sprayed on or added in some sort of like kitchen style baking or cooking process. It doesn't make a ton of sense if you're a consumer of like these types of products. It's sort of like, well, I guess I'm an adult. I don't really know. I want to be like sneaking these Sour Patch Kids in my pocket, out to parties to give to friends. And so that kind of planted a seed in my brain. Maybe there's a better way to consume these products, to consume cannabis, which I kind of, had known there was this really interesting opportunity because, of all the benefits of it and also very, very kind of important responsibility because of the anxiety and paranoia that you mentioned and I've experienced and many others have, that bad pot brownie experience in college will set people off of cannabis forever. And so it wasn't until I got to California business school where I started thinking about this more seriously when California passed its adult use program. And obviously California had a pretty open medical market for a long period of time. And so people kind of knew what they wanted from a cannabis standpoint. It was pretty easy to get and access was much more open than any other state. And as a result of that, I think a lot of the products looked like products that were in the medical market. So some of the beverages that were on the market or in early days were 100 milligrams THC, 90, 40. And it's sort of like, I can't even do 10 in a beverage. And so the idea was, what if we could figure out a way to bring the dosing way down, something really low, make the product taste great. So none of that grassy kind of oily type feel that you might get from the raw cannabis distillate. And really create a brand that stands for something that consumers would purchase and feel connected to. And so those were sort of the big questions we had to go solve, and we went out to see if we could do it. And when we first started formulating and testing with consumers, it became clear that this was exactly what they wanted. They didn't want, some sort of CBD only beverage. It was unclear exactly what it was doing. They didn't want 100 or even 10 milligram THC beverage that would make them anxious or paranoid. They wanted a microdose of THC in a delicious beverage that looked attractive and they could bring anywhere. And they could drink alongside their friends drinking alcohol and feel like they were socializing together. And that was really the key breakthrough.
Yeah, I know out here in the market, we appreciate it. And Marie on our team is heavy into the cannabis scene. And she always talks about how gummies are overdosed. And it's just not how people eat. You don't eat a gummy, you eat a packet of gummies.
Right. It's like we joke, the equivalent would be going into a bar and drinking all the alcohol you're going to drink that night in the first 10 minutes and just being like, let's see what happens. Like I had, 5 shots. It just doesn't make any sense. Like the whole fun of these things is to capture that feeling of sort of adding the buzz, sort of growing the buzz. And you almost want to maintain that lower feeling. It's sort of like, once you're, wasted drunk, you go home. And with cannabis, people were just getting to that point, and it's like, that was the goal. It's like, that doesn't really make a bunch of sense. And so trying to mirror how we consume alcohol in a lot of ways was how we thought about getting the average person that's walking down the street that doesn't really know that much about cannabis or hasn't tried it or had a bad experience. How do we get them back into the industry?
Yeah, you're describing, I think, a Long Island iced tea. I'm pretty sure.
Yes.
Let's talk, while we're on the subject of alcohol, let's talk about hangovers. I know part of your founder story was rough hangovers. I can't hang with alcohol anymore either. Talk to me about hangovers and why you wanted to end them.
It's so funny because my co-founder Luke and I talk about this all the time. We actually met 10 years ago. We started work on the same day at a management consulting firm in San Francisco. And so much of our social life and so much of what it meant to be sort of young in your 20s in a big city was alcohol. It was, we're going to drink on Thursday night. We're going to drink on Friday night. We'll come over and drink on Saturday. Like, let's go out of town and drink. And it was all sort of driven by these like alcohol fueled adventures in lots of ways. It could be as small as a night out on the town as to a long weekend somewhere. And but drinking was the common thread. It's what sort of we all agreed we were going to do, and then our behavior was going to change as a result of that. Great, that's fine when you're 25. As we got older, our hangovers started getting absolutely debilitating. And we aren't the type of people that like, we wanted to get up the next day and like go for a run or exercise or do something athletic or fitnessy. We cared about what we put in our bodies. We were like very mindful of those things. Like we're the people that are turning product, being like, oh, is there anything artificial in this? Or, looking at various macronutrients to understand like what that effect that has on our body. And then here, fast forward to the evenings, we're basically poisoning our liver and then recovering from that poisoning. It's like kind of incongruent. And it became more and more of a problem as we got older. We got into our 30s and said, like, we just can't continue to behave this way. But what was interesting is the social pressure didn't change. Like that's still how people socialize. It's like, let's come over for drinks, come do this, and let's drink alcohol. And so that structure was so built around alcohol that for us, it was like a question of, well, do we just be less fun? Do we socialize less? Is that the right answer? And that didn't feel right to us either. And we really had to figure out like, okay, how do we find balance in this world where physically we can't socialize at the same level, but psychologically, socially, emotionally, we want to. What do we do?
Yeah, I think you solved it. I think you solved it.
We hope so. I mean, it's definitely a step in the right direction. Let's give consumers more options. It's like we'll make the decision. Maybe instead of having 5 beers, I'll have 2 and a couple can, and then that next day I feel great. Those types of things have a big impact.
Yeah. And before we jump into the big questions, I know Cann is a leader in the cannabis space, especially in recreational cannabis. Obviously there's a big push for social equity in this space too, especially as we see millions of prisoners behind bars for cannabis related drug charges. Can you talk through the work you've done there as well?
Yeah, definitely. So it's really important. Luke and I talk about this a lot. Like we're both white men. We're a white founded company. Many of our investors are white men as well. And like, how do we exist in this space, which is so clearly built on the shoulders of Black and brown people that have, many of which have lost their lives or are still imprisoned, gone to prison because of doing the exact thing that we're doing. And like, how do we think about that in context? And so at Cann, what we do is a number of things. Like it starts at home, it starts in the company. What can we do the most tactically every day is like our hiring practices. Like who are we building this team with? And so these are metrics we track. We track top of the funnel representation across a number of metrics, including people of color. And we track that through the entire hiring process. And the idea is that like, if we are really unbiased and interrogating our systems and processes, like if we start with an overrepresented top of the pool, like we will continue to build a team that is diverse in the way we want it to be. The next sort of level from there is like, who are we making wealthy with our decisions, our investors, our partners? Are we asking them questions? And we're one of the first brands in the space to really go to our investors and say, well, why don't you have any Black partners? Like that doesn't make any sense. Or like, tell us about the companies that you founded that are Black owned. They haven't even been asked those questions. And so that's like that's like just the very beginning of that process. When we work with partners, like we're really proud to say that we're in 95% of the Black owned dispensaries in California. That's a metric we want to hit 100% in all of our markets. And then the final one is really about that universe. We can't directly touch it all the time, but we can do a lot to amplify using our platform to amplify those stories. And we can donate, right? We can get resources to the people that are doing this work already and know what they're doing. And so some of that passing the microphone, some of that making sure that the resources, the time, the capital gets into the hands of people that do this social justice work every day is really important to us. And again, something we track. We've got an internal task force, we call Black Lives at Cann, meets on a regular basis and tracks us on these things. Because if you don't track it as a business, nothing will happen. And so it's that's sort of our approach. And there's a lot we still have to do. We are very focused on it. We want to, in many ways, model how this could work for other cannabis brands, and hope that sort of we can start a real snowball effect.
Yeah, that's important and incredible. And we'll link to, I'm sure you've talked about it on your social pages and on LinkedIn too. So we'll link to it in the show notes too, so you can get more information if you are listening to this podcast. All right, let's jump into your goals. Thanks for sharing that and answering that question. All right, Jake, talk to me about a big goal that you've set and accomplished and why it was important to you and how you got there. It's 3 questions in one, but let's do it.
All right. Yeah, great. So my favorite recent goal to talk about is starting a company. So when I applied to Stanford Business School, as part of the application, they ask you sort of like, why do you want an MBA? Like, what is the point of this application? Fairly reasonable question. And, not fully appreciating the magnitude of the sentence, you were allowed one sentence. I wrote, I wanted to get an MBA so I could, leave finance and start a cannabis company. And actually at the time I said in Colorado, because it was not legal in California. Obviously that changed when I got to school in California and sort of shifted a little bit there. But what was interesting about that is I sort of manifested it in some ways in this application. And was the starting point. And maybe because I wrote it down, maybe because I was thinking about it a lot when I made that decision as part of applying, like, what do I put here? Like I always felt in filling out these applications, the best answer is the one that's like true, like most true to you. So I spent a lot of time thinking about that. It's like, yes, that's what I really want to do. But a lot of it was also, how do I not so much trap myself into doing it, right? Because there's so much anxiety and fear around this decision. Like, how do you decide to make that jump? Especially, I'd come from a bunch of different jobs. I was an investment banking analyst. I've worked in management consulting with my co-founder, Luke, and gone into private equity and done a lot of consumer investing. And like, these jobs are intense. They're very fast-paced, really smart people. You're making a lot of money. And that's hard to walk away from. It's hard to be like, how am I then going to move to my parents' basement, buy healthcare off the exchange, right? Like, start thinking about these things that I haven't really thought about in a long time. Like, how do I make ends meet now? All after spending way too much on business school. So very, very tough sort of decision to go down that road. But I think part of it was I knew inside I wanted to do it. And by writing it down, by like making that public, by like sharing that both with university and also with others, it kind of started me on a trajectory that then you could always pull off of, but at least it got the pieces moving. And then in some ways I was really lucky that I got to go to business school. So I had this like 2-year period where I really treated it like a laboratory, where I didn't have sort of the societal expectations to have a job and make money. I showed up for class, I met friends. And then with the rest of the time, I started digging into these big questions of like, well, what is the right product for consumers in the cannabis industry? Like, how do we think about this? And, Bain teaches you, well, what about analogs? Are there other analogs? And so, oh, great, there's caffeine, there's alcohol. Those seem kind of like mild intoxicants as well. How do we consume them, interestingly, in a beverage? And maybe more importantly, in a microdose. And so, sort of start thinking about it. And a lot of that was intellectual sort of work, like, how do I think this through? But it started continuing to move that ball forward, and then have hundreds of conversations with people in the industry. Like, that was the easiest thing, in some ways the hardest, but also the easiest, because it's like, who doesn't want to talk with a student who's interested in learning more about the space that you're in? And then as a student, I can kind of talk to a bunch of people because I have the time. And having those conversations, you start to realize, oh, wow, there's like so much that I don't know. Okay, how do I start learning the stuff I don't know? And then that was really the exercise I went on for sort of the first year of business school. It wasn't until the second year that I actually started making something. And that's really important too. No matter what, I think, business you want to go into, there's ultimately some sort of product or service like that you will be selling. And so go make it, go do it. And for me, that was forced carbonating flavored beverage in my garage, with the whole setup and putting it into brown bottles and capping them with crown caps and sending those products out to classmates to be like, see what you think. Here's like a 10-question survey, drink 6 of them or share them or do whatever you want with it, and then answer these questions. And we get all this data back, which is really interesting. And we learned a lot. We learned like, people like lower dose. The thing they're most afraid of is getting too high. It's like, whoa, that's interesting. Now, obviously it's a certain subset of consumers, but the way Luke and I approached this problem was, let's design something for us. If we love it, then the bet stops being whether people will love this, and it starts being whether there are people like us out there. And I like that bet a lot better. And so we worked really, really hard to find something both of us loved. And then we played around with flavor a lot, right? One of the things we heard from consumers was, I want this to feel adult, right? We're moving beyond the gummy candies and chocolates. Like, this should be something that makes me feel a little adventurous. Maybe it reminds me of a cocktail. Maybe it reminds me of, something that I wouldn't give to a child. And that's important because at the end of the day, this is very much a distinctly adult product, and it's meant for adult consumption. It's also, adults like to feel adventurous when they're trying stuff. And so we learned, consumers will go with you one jump. You can put cardamom in the product if blood orange is the first thing because they know, okay, I kind of know what blood orange is going to taste like. All right, I'll see what this cardamom thing is all about. And that was really important. So we started kind of building and building to the point where we got to a place where friends would say, you have to do this. Like, you have to start this company. Like, we need this to exist. And that type of pressure was really valuable because it kept me thinking, at least, oh, wow, like there is something here. Like, we have come up with something. The surprise on people's face when they drink it and they were like, wow, I was expecting that to be much worse. It actually tastes amazing. Those types of things were really helpful. All of that aside, it still was really difficult because I think primarily in taking a big risk like this, and I think most people that start companies have some version of this, but the people that are most close to you are often the ones that are most critical, most afraid, least supportive. And it's because their relationship with you is defined based on fear. Like, they want you to live a low risk life because then you'll be happier. Like, why would you introduce risk here? Like that like mechanism of control that we try to put on top of the people that we love because we don't want them to be unhappy. But what I think it misses is that no one really knows what's going on inside your head. No one really knows what will make you happy but yourself. And you have to kind of be that advocate and be willing to take on pretty terrifying short-term, what you hope is short-term pain and anxiety, with the bet that like over the long term, that will make you happy and that will give you meaning and purpose in your life. And so that's the biggest challenge, at least for me, in getting this goal across the line, was how do I deal with the emotions, not always overt, but very clear from the people I love, from my parents, from my boyfriend, from my friends that are saying, I don't know if you should do this, or what's the status of your interviews with private equity firms, right? Like, and in little ways, they sort of chip away at your bold action forward on this company, and that's really challenging because you want your relationship with those people to be close in these moments because you're like, wow, I'm about to take a big step, I'm about to take a big risk, and actually they're making it much harder. What's cool is, if you're successful, and maybe even if you're not, but if you do it, if you actually jump and start the company, do the thing, they're the first to come around. They're the first to recognize how well it's going and like, or how proud, how much you're learning, or how proud they are of it. For me, I think with my parents, it was them seeing how like engaged I was in a way that I never was in another job. Like, it just fully consumed me, for better or for worse. But like, that's what I needed, and they recognized that that's what I needed, and it all kind of fell into place. And so, despite it being hard in the moment, it is the thing that resolves the quickest, which is kind of great. And yeah, that's really the story.
Yeah, it's so funny. I talk about that same phenomenon, the parental guardrail phenomenon. People,
Right.
I've experienced that too. I think everyone has. If you've started a company, I always tell people to tell your parents last.
Right. Yeah.
Because they'll try to protect you from your big idea.
They really will. It's funny.
Yeah,
I saw a statistic at one point that immigrants are much more likely to start companies, and there's all this analysis about why, and risk-seeking behavior, et cetera. And I was like, oh, it's clearly because they're farther away from their parents. Like, that must be it. I'm sure that's the dominant effect.
Or yeah, it could be that, and it could be the I'm here for the American dream. like get it, go and get it. So okay, you're doing all of this. You're in business school. You've got these 2 years to sort of incubate, try things, make the thing. What is happening with Luke in the meantime? Is he also at Stanford with you, or what was he doing in the meantime?
So Luke had already been to business school, sort of led the way for me in that respect. He was at Harvard Business School actually when I was in Boston. And that worked really well because we continued to be friends. And actually, through that whole period, I had kind of like been talking to him about this idea that I had. So since Colorado legalized, and what about beverage? I think it's beverage. The industry, the systems aren't ready for it yet, but when they are, it's going to be beverage. Like, I was convinced that we will all look back in 10 years and be drinking cannabis instead of anything else. And he didn't really believe me. He was sort of like, I'm kind of like on the alcohol train. That makes more sense to me. And it's true, like in lots of ways, we are a brand that is inclusive of all other social beverage options. People are not going to stop drinking alcohol. It has just a totally different, immediate sort of effect that it's going to be really hard to overcome. I would argue though that effect has a much more significant or diminishing return. So like when you start having like 3, 4, 5, 6 drinks, it's like, it's actually not helping as much. But that first drink, there's something about the first drink with alcohol, you're never really going to compete with. And so, it took him having really bad hangovers and some time to start saying, okay, hold on, I agree with you. Like this is clearly the worst thing that I'm doing to my body. And we care so much about all these other bad things that we do to our bodies. Like, why are we not talking about this? And I think finally was able to get him to start paying attention to it. And it was great because he stayed at Bain & Company and had been spending a lot of his time working with massive CPG companies, trying to get them to act more like startups, which is a really, really valuable skill in the context of starting a startup. It's like you have the context of like, what does this company look like at the end state? But then what are all the things that companies do wrong to prevent themselves from being quick, from innovating? How do we break things down into smaller and smaller chunks so that we can continue to move the ball forward? And that was a really, really valuable skill. So when he was kind of at the end of his time at Bain thinking, wow, I'm ready for a change, to do something new, that was right about when I started talking to him saying, hey, I think I'm going to graduate and do this full time. Like, what do you think? And it actually was funny. At one point he was the one who was saying like, you have to do this. If you don't, I'm just going to go do it, which was very persuasive.
So you convinced him, you got him on board. All right, let's talk about the future. I'm so excited to hear what Cann has coming up. So talk to us about a big goal that you're setting for the future. I also want to know how you're planning to set it, because it sounds like writing things down and saying them aloud is really impactful for you. And how are you going to get there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, once we launched the company, and like that was a big thing, like getting the product to market, until we actually had something on shelves, it didn't feel real. And that's a weird thing. I think for anyone that has some sort of product company, you're working so hard, often the hardest you'll work before the product even exists, but like nothing to show for it. Yeah. And so that was a really important moment for us. That was like kind of like, okay, let's turn the page. And as it was doing really well, we had to kind of think about, well, what are we building here? Like, what is this? Because initially it was like making cannabis more mainstream, right? Like, how do we create this product that's going to bring a plant that we know can have a huge impact on people and their lives, particularly their social lives, to the people that are maybe the most resistant to it. And we had this product that was going to do that. Very quickly, it became clear that what we wanted to build is a social beverage company, where the goal is to change how people socialize. And that was really again, to your point about writing things down, we wrote it up on a big whiteboard. So like, what is our main thing? We learned this from the founders of the Innocent Company. Keep the main thing the main thing. You have to focus as a small startup. And for us, it was like no longer mainstream cannabis. It was social beverage. How do we change the way people socialize? And what's cool about that is our product helps with this, but it's only one piece of the whole picture, right? So we have a structure all built around alcohol, where you go in, it's dark, there's loud music, right? Like the whole culture of like the physical spaces that we're in, and when we consume alcohol and how we do that is built around characteristics of alcohol, right? Kind of obscuring your vision of sort of, people talk a lot about alcohol being a social lubricant. I like to think about it as it sort of moves you socially into a new place that you're a little bit detached from who you really are or want to be. And that plays really well to a dark, loud bar. You can't really talk, you can't really hear, you can't really see. It's like, hold on, this is all like very disorienting. And probably not right for how you want to interact or meet a new person or spend time with a person that you already know and care about. So how do social spaces change? What does that look like, right? We unfortunately have been delayed, and I think what we would have seen over the last year in on-premise consumption of cannabis products, in a number of states, but particularly we're focused in California because of the pandemic. And hopefully, over the next few months, we'll start to see some of those get up and running. But they're going to look very different than sort of your loud, crowded, dark bar, and they should. And that's really something that's really interesting to us. Like, how do we help work with the people that are in hospitality and in these physical spaces, coming up with really cool concepts to integrate our products to help move that along, right? Regulation is always a big topic in the industry. And one of the things we're wrestling with as a company is like, how involved are we in shaping these regulations? Like, at the end of the day, we are creating the safest cannabis products on the market. They're the lowest dose. You actually have to physically drink a decent amount of liquid to get that dose. So it's like, in some ways, it's like even, it has like an additional protection against consuming too much. And the amount you basically have to chug a 6-pack in an hour to have a negative impact, and that's still probably the same as if you just took a gun, right? So we really are talking about how do we as a brand talk to regulators, talk to policymakers about how they should have a vested interest in beverage because they're the safest, particularly those microdose beverages, right? And what starts to happen to society when that's the case, when people are drinking less alcohol, right? We talked a lot about all the abuse, whether it's physical abuse, child abuse, violence in the home, drunk driving. There are all sorts of things, suicides, that are related to alcohol. The cannabis has either none or much, much better indications around. So we think there's like a whole societal issue here that can help change the way people socialize, could improve how our cities work, how our social spaces work, how, that long strip of restaurants and bars is on a, midnight on a Saturday, may look very, very different, right? If we have cannabis beverages as an option for folks. We're a long way away from that, but that is the big next goal. That's how we think about all of the products we put into market. Are we advancing this idea of making our social lives a little bit more authentic, a little bit more ourselves, having a little bit more control about our interactions with others, being more true to our own preferences. And it starts with our product, which is great. It's a launching off point for us. And then there's all these other really cool things going on around us that we can engage with and work on. One example is we do a number of private events where we can have cannabis products and alcohol products alongside each other for free for folks in someone's home or a wedding. We've seen these kind of pop up as we've been on the market over the last couple of years. And it's incredible. Like, people have such positive experiences. They feel so much better the next day. They have just as much, if not more fun the night of. And to see these events where you have alcohol and cannabis products alongside each other is pretty incredible. The key to it is you don't have too much alcohol and you don't have too much THC. So our products work great for that. But alcohol is still the most dangerous part of that equation. But we're starting to see little glimmers of what the future could look like. And that's really exciting.
Oh, that's exciting. I'm picturing like an adult play. I think of like the bar that should have been designed for me as someone who is in my 30s, where it's like the music's, an appropriate volume.
Right.
And I can see and talk to my friends. And I have my wits about me. Like, I'm picturing that experience. And I would be so delighted to see that come to life.
Much better.
Can't wait.
Yeah.
I can't wait. I was hoping you were going to say something was open, because I'll be in Napa in the next week. So I was hoping that I could experience it for myself, but
unfortunately not, but sooner rather than later, we're hoping.
COVID just slowed us all down, but I can't wait to see that come to life. And so what's the experience that you want to get out of it? Is it what I just described? What is your night out going to look like?
Yeah, it's not that far off from what you're describing. I think it's funny, as I've been involved in this company over the last few years, we'll have a handful of events, and I'm always very cautious about what I'm drinking, mostly because I'm interested in how people perceive me at these events, right? But there's a balance. Like, I think what's so great about what we're doing is we're providing an option, another option, we think a better option. But that doesn't mean, like, our best consumers start out as really big alcohol drinkers, and they end up as still kind of more than average alcohol drinkers, but that gap is actually really big. And so the idea of having a couple of beers and a couple of cans is exactly like, that's like my perfect thought. It's like listening to your body and saying, what do I need right now? Okay, maybe what I need is an immediate like lowering of my cortisol. Alcohol is going to do that really, really well. But for me, it's like what maybe I need a little bit later on in that evening is to calm down the inside of my brain so I can meet people where they are and have an actual conversation with them, ask interesting questions, listen, interact. That's really hard to do with alcohol, I find, at least for me. And so that balance, thinking about like what you need in any given moment, and being able to choose that and feel like you're in control is really exciting. And maybe the next thing I need is like neither alcohol nor can. And maybe, we have a product called Spike, which we've just launched, but it's exactly the same can flavors, but no THC or CBD. We've been able to share it with so many more people, obviously, because we can send it across the country. But maybe I need that. Maybe I just need like a quick break, and then I'll be back on something else. I think that intentionality, that control for me is what's most exciting about how things will change. And then it's interesting because I think those folks, once they have the option, will select the environments that suit them best, as opposed to what happens right now is like we actually are forced into an environment we don't really like, and then we use alcohol to sort of cope with it. And then everyone's losing in that scenario.
Yep. We were able to give out unspiked at our recent event hosted over the summer called Sweat Working Week, and we had such great feedback. People loved it. It was delightful. So thank you for that.
Yes, of course.
Which makes me think back to Gen Z. Gen Z, we're seeing they're drinking less alcohol overall. So you're building, not only you're building a product for folks who don't want to have hangovers, you're building a product for the next generation.
Yes.
Are you seeing folks talking about that in that generation too?
Definitely, we are. It's funny because at least we saw this trend happen with millennials, particularly some of the younger millennials. It was already playing out in some ways. Gen Z has like taken it to another level. Some of the Gen Z, we are not our customers and will not be until they turn 21. But the ones that are, we're seeing it as well. And that's really interesting. And a lot of them, especially in California, have grown up in their entire lives in a pretty open legal cannabis environment. Now, obviously medical, but that has had an impact. Like it's amazing. Talk to a 16-year-old in California, they know more about cannabis than anyone else in any other state. Their whole lives in this open environment. So you start to see like, what does a smarter world look like? Now, obviously, I think we would prefer that nobody under 21 like develop your brain fully before having cannabis products. That's really important, and alcohol as well. But I think we focus very clearly on that because it is the one thing that's a little bit scary in some of the medical data. We're going to learn more, and there's only been a handful of studies, but I think that like develop your brain, but then have the option. Don't be forced into this like binge drinking alcohol culture that so many of us, at least the prior generations, have gone through. We're starting to see that consciousness come from the Gen Z that I just don't think wasn't there before, which is really exciting and also like encouraging for that generation. Interestingly as well, we do see declining alcohol consumption rates at another demographic, which is much, much older. So this is usually not by choice. It's usually because a doctor is saying something like, you really need to stop drinking alcohol. You maybe have some sort of medical issue, or as you get older and older in life, the doctor will tend to recommend some lifestyle changes to help you live longer. And that's been really interesting for us. Like at one point, we're like, are we building like a grandparents brand here? Like some of our best accounts are in these snowbird places in California, like Palm Springs. And it's older people that are basically saying like, yeah, I love having something cold in my hand that gives me a buzz, but I don't need to be drinking as much alcohol as I was drinking when I was younger. And so it's happening in all of these places. The frustration with alcohol is pretty universal. And we're sort of playing into that. And you're seeing other brands doing it as well with no ABV products. A lot of them don't give you the buzz though. And that's what people really want. And so I think we're on the very beginning of a new era of beverages that don't have alcohol, but do have a buzz. And that's really kind of the key thing that we were able to figure out with cannabis.
I love it. Jake, I could talk to you all day, and I get the sense that you could talk all day too, that you have a lot of excitement around Cann and cannabis, but I won't keep you. Alas, I have one last question. So tell me, we like to know what your self-care routine is or tip that's helping you to stay sane, healthy, or productive in this unusual time in our world.
Yeah, it's a great question. So one that's very top of mind, I'm like addicted to one drug, and that is sleep. Sleep is like the most important thing. I mean, you can control all these other factors with pretty easy amount of attention, whether it's your diet or hydration, activity levels, right? It can be hard sometimes when you're working a lot, but even just like, I'll take a walking meeting, great, like I'm active. Sleep is the one that's like, the more stressed you are, the more your environment, whether it's starting a company or being in the middle of one, or there's crises every day. It's like really, really hard for me to turn off my brain and fall asleep. And so there's a ton of really interesting things out there that people have tried. I've tried a number of them, but the one that I'm most excited about right now is we think a lot about sleep being impacted by light. And so our circadian rhythm and these things, and that's very adaptive and makes sense. Sound as well, like you're sleeping in a cave, there's loud sound. You should probably wake up to protect yourself. And so we can control for those. But what people don't talk about is temperature. Temperature is also something that is very deeply embedded into our brains. We're supposed to sleep when it's dark, when it's quiet, and it's cold. And that's kind of controversial because some people run hot, some people run cold. There's like all sorts of different body temperatures, right? Natural settings. But it's more about how you sleep relative to that, right? And so I've been playing around with this, a really cool mattress cover that goes over my bed, and it can control the temperature of both sides. And for me, I make myself much colder in the beginning of the night to help me fall asleep and stay asleep. And then I sort of slowly warm up through the evening. And I track this stuff with Whoop. and which is fantastic for understanding changes as I've introduced different things, whether they're sort of external environmental things or different like supplements or diet changes. And I'm having record number of sort of REM restorative sleep relative to the baseline before, from just keeping my mattress cold, which is pretty amazing, and allows me to do something like sleep. Instead of sleeping, before I'd have to sleep 9 hours to get that same amount of restorative sleep, I can sleep 7 or 7.5. And that's actually really, really helpful. And something I'd highly recommend to folks that are either really stressed out, have trouble sleeping, only can get a certain amount of sleep, might as well make it count.
Yeah. Is that mattress cover called Chili Sleep?
So Chili Sleep is one that does it. There's also one called 8 Sleep. And I think they're both great products.
Mm-hmm. I honestly, I cannot vouch for this enough. I actually, if I can't fall asleep, I'll put an ice pack behind my knees and I'm like out. I recently put Chili Sleep on my own holiday gift list in hopes that my husband will get it for me.
Yes, you'll love it.
I can't wait. Jake, this was incredible. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you want folks to know about Cann, about you, about your goals?
We covered a lot. I would just say, if you're out there listening to this and thinking, hey, should I start a company? That sounds kind of cool. Like, do it. It's the most rewarding thing you'll do in your life, even if it fails miserably in 3 months, 6 months. Give it 6 months at least. But I highly recommend.
Give it a go. And check out Cann. You can find the states where they are sold and the dispensaries where they are sold as well on their website. We will link to that in the show notes as well. Thank you, Jake.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much.
This has been another episode of We Got Goals, which is a sweatlife.com production. Thanks to you, our dear listener, to Ryan Deffett for audio production, and to Ryan Barayuga for video.